Welcome, friends, to this presentation of Hidden Histories, Faith and Black Lesbian Leadership with author Monique Moultrie and Reverend Derrick McQueen. I am Mark Bowman, Executive Director of the LGBTQ Religious Archives Network, the host of tonight's program. LGBTQ RAN is a unique venture dedicated to preserving the history of LGBTQ religious movements around the world. LGBTQ RAN is a digital enterprise. We are not a physical repository that stores papers. We advise and support leaders and groups in their efforts to preserve their records in appropriate archives. Furthermore, we collect and provide a treasure of historical information on our website about LGBTQ plus persons and groups from a wide array of religious expressions around the world. And finally, we encourage research and scholarship in queer religious history. Tonight, we are pleased to present an in-depth discussion of Monique Moultrie's newly published book, Hidden Histories, Faith and Black Lesbian Leadership from Duke University Press. In this work, Moultrie uses oral histories of Black lesbian religious leaders in the United States to show how their authenticity, social justice awareness, spirituality, and collaborative leadership makes them models of womanist ethical leadership. By examining their life histories, Moultrie frames queer storytelling as an ethical act of resistance to the racism, sexism, and heterosexism these women experience. Monique Moultrie, Ph.D., is an associate professor of religious studies at Georgia State University, as well as author of Hidden Histories. Her scholarly interests include sexual ethics, African American religions, and gender and sexuality studies. Among her previous publications is Passionate and Pious: Religious Media and Black Women's Spirituality from Duke University Press in 2017. Dr. Moultrie will be interviewed by Reverend Derrick McQueen, Ph.D., who is the Associate Director of the Center for African American Religion, Sexual Politics, and Social Justice at Columbia University. He also serves as the pastor of St. James Presbyterian Church in Harlem, New York City. McQueen's interests include early Christian community models of social justice and their modern applications on issues such as poverty, sexuality, race, and gender. To those of you watching this webinar, we welcome your comments or questions in the chat box or the Q&A function. The presenters will respond to those during the Q&A time toward the end of tonight's program. If you would like to offer personal greetings or comments to the presenters, stay on after the webinar is concluded, and you will be invited into the Zoom room with them. Please direct any technical concerns to Asati, who is the tech manager for this program. Now, I am pleased to welcome Derrick McQueen and Monique Moultrie to this discussion of Hidden Histories, Faith and Black Lesbian Leadership.
Good evening, Monique.
Hey.
It's so good to be with you in this capacity this evening. We've been in so many different rooms together, but this is a special room tonight, and I'm grateful to be able to be here with you for this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for being the interlocutor tonight.
You're welcome. I just want to start by saying that I consider this work an incredible interweaving of an oral history collection that actually weaves incredible depth of an enfleshed history into the tapestries of like theology, spiritualities, religions, and Blackness. And I thank you. I thank you for being able to show how our lives there's application to that in those realms as well as beyond. And I'm looking forward to this discussion from this. So I just wanted to let you know that that's how I feel about what you've shared with us today, what you're sharing with us. So thank you. But from the outset, you and I were thinking about this conversation this evening, and from the outset, why don't we sort of lay the groundwork about what is the need? What did you see the need for the excavation of these particular stories of the hidden histories of faith, Black, lesbian leadership? What was the need for that, to excavate that?
Yeah, so I always tell my origin story. I started with LGBTQ Ran in 2009. They had received a small grant to help diversify some of the profiles and the bio sketches on the website. And they hired me while I was still in my doctoral program to just go out and interview as many people as the money would allow me to travel and go to research. And I did that, and honestly didn't think much about it. And then Ibrahim Faraji died. And when he died, many people started citing things that he had said to me in the oral history that I'd done with him. And I realized that these stories didn't exist many other places. And I thought, wow, what an honor that was to have taken that story. And the Ibrahim one was really interesting. Like, we did this interview over like a 2-year period, and he was in Pakistan, and then he was in Istanbul, and at one point he was in a cave, like literally in a cave doing a religious ritual. And I was honored to take the story, to listen to the story, but I didn't know that anything was beyond that. And from that conversation that I was having in my head after Ibrahim died, I started thinking, well, what about these other folks who's chronicling their stories? How do we get more eyes and more attention on their stories? So I just started cold calling people and saying, hey, can I interview you for the LGBTQ Red website? And I do an interview, and Mark would graciously put it up. And it took about 10 years before I started to think of it as a book. These were just things I was doing, as my tradition says, for the good of the kingdom. I just thought these stories were ones that needed to exist. They needed to be out there. And what turned them into a book is Auburn Seminary. I participated in a cross currents conversation where the theme that year was social justice. And I had started noticing that a large number of the people that I interviewed were also engaging in some social justice activism. And I thought, this is what leadership looks like. This is what I want from my leaders. How do we get more people to do what they're doing? And I applied for the program. And in the program, it's a month long. You come to New York and stay. And during that month, the group that I had, you present. So you workshop the work in progress. And when I presented, at that point, I was still interviewing men and women. And they said, you seem really more animated with the women. It really seems like there's something there that's unique for you. And talk to us about that. Like, what is interesting, what is appealing? And they really pushed me to make a move to only interview women and to think about what would storytelling be from their perspective. And that's sort of how we came to this being a book, how we came to this being a book about Black lesbians. But I think it was always my desire to excavate the stories so that they existed.
I'm very aware of that particular program that you were in at Auburn at that time. I remember sort of crafting and thinking about that happening. So I'm very excited to hear that, that opportunity of deliberate focus helped you to really think about this and framing this kind of a work, and then to telling their stories and getting those stories ingrained in you. And then 10 years later, it's sort of flowering and blossoming, as it were, into where we are now. Your book is very focused, especially on cisgender lesbians. So I wanted to talk to you just a little bit and hear from you about what do you think about why did you choose to frame the book around cisgendered lesbians?
Yeah. And I want to say, I honestly, this was one of the blinders of, I think, my own heterosexism that I didn't think through. Because when I came to Auburn, I had my this is my wish list. help me find these people. They exist in the world. Where are they? And it was sort of like find a friend. Like
Right.
someone would tell someone, this girl is looking for you. I always tell the Renee Hill story because I stalked Renee Hill over every medium, Twitter, Facebook. I was in listservs. I was like calling people, do you know someone who lives on the block that Renee Hill lives on that you could like go put a note on her door? Because I really wanted to do her interview. And I was sending emails and she wasn't responding. And so I literally was doing that work. And what ended up happening is my wish lists were all cisgender women because I didn't think about it. I just thought, like, who do I know that I think has an awesome story that we should talk about, that more people should know about? And once I interviewed that person, I asked them at the end, now who should I go interview? And they would send me to another friend of theirs. And largely, they all sent me to other cisgender Black women. And it was a snowball effect.
Right.
I wasn't even really conscious of at the time. They're hearing. I wasn't conscious of it at the time that, oh, you have selected this in a particular way. And so once I wrote another grant to then go out and intently interview transgender religious leaders, Black religious leaders. And I have not done one. That is a true challenge, largely because that friend network of like, do you know someone who can tell someone that I'm cool to talk to? I don't know anyone, or I don't know a deep enough bench in the trans community that it's been an easy task. I've interviewed some trans men, but I've not gotten trans women, trans Black women. And I think that's a deficit of the work, but I definitely, I own up to that. I say, like, this is a book and this is how it was created this way, with blinders and not blinders. And this is still what I think it can tell you.
That's a really wonderful point about this. And I also see that what you're saying is that there's also a foundation that's been laid now for that network and for that internal network of I know a friend and I know a friend and I know a friend, and that trust component that you're talking about that happens very often in oral history interviews. That there's a foundation and a methodology that's been laid out now that can even be built upon what you've done and what you're doing. So that's encouraging, and recognizing about sort of quote unquote the lack, we can sort of find what can be built upon that, and I'm really excited about that. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah,
that's very cool to do that.
So some folks in the chat, like if y'all know some trans women that you can vouch for me after the end of this, like stay on.
Stay on. Yes.
I still want to do those interviews.
Oh, they're going to be very rich. They're going to be very rich. I want to ask you a little bit about how did you come into building your process to move forward with this work? Of course, that includes your inspiration for this particular work, because I want to frame that when I talk about this work, that your larger category and your larger sensibility of vocation and call for your work is so inclusive of so many of the themes that are within your book. But so that when I say this particular work, I'm not sort of like just sort of eschewing that that's not your reality, but I want to say in this particular work, who you are sort of come into play in the inspiration and in the building and the process moving forward with this work.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I was trained as a womanist scholar.
Right.
And some of my earliest classes in divinity school were with womanist and Black feminist scholars, Emily Towns, Tracy West, others. So they taught me early that I could be in the story, that was just, that was, in fact, what everybody does, and they just don't claim it. So that's why there are I statements. Like I own up to like my own wish list did not have this intentionality and why that was. I also think that the story or my interest in the social justice movements came really from this true sense of we need more leaders that are ethical.
Yes.
We need more leaders that are committed to the thriving of everyone, not just the people in their pews, not just the people in their towns, but like that see the interconnected pieces, that see, what affects you in this little town in Little Rock also affects me in Brooklyn, also affects me. And, I just saw someone who's here from the continent, that we have to have these conversations because we are one planet. And so those are like my own core principles. And so I gravitated towards finding those women more cool. Like I found them more appealing as stories that I wanted to know more about. Because ultimately what I thought I was doing was lending, amplifying the stories that existed. And the more I sat with the transcripts, and I talked with friends, when I say in chapter 5, a dear friend of mine, Albert Smith, he's a DI consultant. He said to me, well, what if this is a book for queer leaders? Like, what if this is not to tell the straights, hey, y'all are doing it wrong and we've got a better model. But what if it's to say, no, every leader should look at this leader because this is the way that sustainable leadership happens. And for me, that felt life-giving because I'd seen so many good things burn out and not be sustained. And I'm doing a lot of work now on reproductive justice. And I literally just read in the New York Times today, they were talking about how the pro-abortion side doesn't seem to have a agenda beyond like, hey, we want it to be okay.
Right.
And, it takes strategy. It takes, how do we get the ballot initiatives done? And for me, that's the leadership model that I wanted to point to. Folks that knew how to do a succession model, who knew how to handle, church hurt and church splits, and who knew how to handle, what do you do on Mother's Day if 2/3 of your congregation has a contentious relationship with their mothers? Like they were just doing church differently. They were doing their religious performances differently. And I think if we look at the data that's out there, that's what's needed.
Yes.
Because we can't keep doing what we've been doing because we see that there is a tremendous decline in all of our mainline Christian denominations. So when we look at other religious traditions, they're also losing people, or I won't say losing as much as people are blending tradition. They're, I'm Baha'i and I'm this, I'm Jewish and I'm Buddhist. But that seems like a loss if you were counting on them to come and pay temple dues. So looking at these models of women who could hold these many different strands in their hand and then still do the work, still do the justice work, still be concerned about HIV and AIDS and homelessness and prison recidivism and this and that, and have that all be in the center of their, like, this is the work we do. For me, that's what I was invested in, and that's what I wanted, the stories I wanted to tell.
I love the way that you answered that question, because it also leads to us being able to really focus on the specification of the womanist train of thought and how that fuels into the understanding of this idea of social justice and the growth into that that you build into your leadership with the lens that you've put through with that. Can you talk a little bit more about the womanist ethical leadership? I love that idea and I love that phrase. And I just wanted to ask you to sort of share a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I was trained as a Walker womanist. So Alice Walker created this term, womanist, and Io Yatunde and I, we think, she does a definition in Search of Our Mother's Garden, of like 4-part definition. And most womanists go back to that 4-part definition. But prior to that, she writes in a short story that she's a womanist. And the short story is about a woman whose husband is addicted to porn and who accuses his wife of being a lesbian because she has an issue. Like, she's become feminist, and for him, feminist equals lesbian. And that's why he has to use porn, because his wife's a lesbian. So, I found in womanism the space to not jettison my Christianity.
Right.
I came to college and divinity school, and then my PhD, a deeply concerned person of faith. And what I found in Black feminism, and I'm overgeneralizing, but what I read in Black feminism was a innate skepticism to religion as yet one more thing that was holding Black women down. And it is, like, hear me clearly say, patriarchy is real. But what I found in womanism was the ability to say the patriarchy is real, and we still have organizing power, and we still have agency that we're using, and we're still transforming our communities in these spaces. And I didn't have to jettison that part of myself. I could bring it along. And so womanism says, like, all of your identities are relevant, and they're the lens you see the world in. So what I try to point out in the text is that I'm not just tagging on womanist in front of ethical
exactly,
and saying, hey, just, womanist equals Black woman, a Black woman who's an ethical leader. I'm not doing that. I'm saying what I'm pointing us to is a type of leadership model that takes into account all of your identity formations as essential and core to how you lead, what communities you feel responsible to and for, and how it motivates you for the thriving for all of creation. So womanism as a category, part of the Walker definition, is a womanist is concerned for the thriving of everyone. So you can't just be, Black woman oriented, although, I am. I can't just be Black woman oriented, or I can't just be Black Christian oriented, or I can't just be, Black disability oriented, whatever my categories are, that those are how I see the world, but I know we're interconnected. So how do we all thrive? How does my thriving exist without being dependent upon your being diminished? And that's what womanist leadership for me does. And that's what I saw with these women, even though I think only 5, 6 maybe of the 18 that I interviewed identified as womanist. I still found it to be a term that fit.
What I really love about this is that I use that word "enfleshed" when I made my first comment, because there is actual flesh on the bones of all of this, and leadership, and the way that we study leadership, and even the deep dive that you do in chapter 5 of leadership. You are enfleshing through womanism and through Black womanist wisdom, even your own. I figure I always see womanism as a Black womanism. And that wisdom that comes forth, that does embrace and include, but it comes forth from the wisdom of that self and that understanding of that self and that deep divine. But there's a beautiful way that when you apply it in front of ethical leadership, you expand and enflesh the notion of ethical leadership.
Yeah.
And that's what I really like. And I noticed, speaking of chapter 5, I wrote this one down because I wanted to remember this. You mentioned that right before you go into womanist ethical leadership, I found this great quote where you said, "Yet every woman I interviewed wrestled with the public acknowledgement of her call to religious authority." And I wanted you to just speak a little bit about this thought, the distinction between the call to religious leadership and religious authority, and to think about, did you also sense a reticence, conscious or unconscious, perhaps even maybe self-preservation, to step into that kind of authority, or should I say an experienced model of flawed authority as a leadership model, as part of, I can't do this, I'm not going to step into this. And that gives the opening for many of them to say, I'm going to try this, I'm going to try that. I know that it's a lot, but I wanted to sort of leave it out.
That's so interesting, because I'm thinking of the story Bishop Plunder tells of learning to preach within the Kojic tradition that doesn't ordain women, and having to, do it from the floor and say, she isn't preaching, but thank you for letting this humble woman have an opportunity to testify to the goodness of God, and then like wrecks the house, preaches up a storm.
Mm-hmm.
But like learning to perform within the patriarchy, for me, is about her clearly knowing her authority. Like she clearly knew the space of authority, and that it wasn't situated in the pulpit, that it was situated in the fact that she had the word of God in her. And she knew she had a solid word, and she knew the people would respond to the word. So for me, many of the women, and part of where that comes up in chapter 5 is I'm trying to explain sort of some of these differences that I see between Black gay leaders and Black female lesbian leaders, queer leaders, who don't have access to the same type of religious leadership cachet. So that means literally like the years of experience, the years of contacts, the years of networks, the buildings, the building funds, the endowments, that not being able to see themselves as a leader in that way distance them from accessing those resources. Not one man that I spoke to, like many, many men that I interviewed, had some qualms about, well, my church has told me that I can't be gay, and my church has told me the gay people are going to hell. But not one of them had a qualm about like their call to ministry. They were very clear. God has called me. The church has a problem. The church is not caught up to what God has already said to me. Every one of the women said, God has called me, but the church will have an absolute issue.
Right.
And their issue isn't even that they know I'm gay. Their issue is the stuff that I can't hide, that I don't even have to whisper about, that they're going to have an issue with. And they hadn't seen those models of women in religious leadership. They had seen religious authority, women in religious authority. Every one of them knew a woman who was running their congregation.
Right.
They knew, when I interviewed Bishop Rawls in Charlotte, she was saying to me, she had all these rich stories of like Pentecostal women who clearly could not be in anybody's leadership line of succession or ascension, but they were the movers and shakers. Like nothing passed in the budget until Mother so-and-so said, she nodded her head, and the male pastor knew, okay, now I can make a motion because it'll carry. Like, so they were very clear that they knew where authority was, but they didn't know where leadership was.
Wow, that's really wonderful. I'm so glad we dove into that. And as we move into leadership, I have to commend you and say thank you so much for just talking so much about so many of the other components and ideas of how this plays into different leadership models. And speaking of the considerations of queer leadership as models of ethical leadership for sustained social change, some of these leadership models of like collaborative leadership. And I wanted you to I love the idea that you actually talked about the pluses of collaborative leadership and then a couple of the drawbacks to them. Yeah. But yet collaborative leadership is one of those seeds that sort of pours into. So that's one of the things I wanted to highlight in some of our last 10 minutes about, can you talk about some of those leadership styles and especially sort of focus in a little bit on that collaborative model as well?
Yeah. So collaboration for me so when I had these 3 questions, I was trying to understand social justice and how I was trying to understand how these leaders were sustained. And I was trying to understand the role of succession, like really, how do we make it to the next leader? Mm-hmm. And I say the book is about, being your authentic self. The book is about being in tune with your spirituality. The book is clearly about having some social justice consciousness, but it also is about collaboration. Every one of them, I think, again, because of this lack of access to that cachet of resources, we're dependent upon collaboration because they couldn't just say, hey, mommy, hey, daddy, start me a congregation, fund me, go fund me an institution. And so they depended on others. And I think it isn't just a negative. It wasn't just because of patriarchy they turned to collaboration. I think they also knew that collaboration was more sustainable, that I don't have to have all of the gifts. I don't have to preach and sing and play the piano and lead the Bible study and drive the van and that if I am called to lead this congregation, I'm called to help them see their gifts, help them live into their passions. And so it's a both and. It's a deficit, but it's also clearly like, this is a better model. I may have been, twisted into it because I needed a building, and then I realized so-and-so wasn't using the building on Tuesdays or wasn't using the building on 3 o'clock on Sundays. But now I got a ministry. One of the bishops in DC,
Right.
she has a booming work around immigration within a Black congregation that's really largely about Latinx immigration.
Wow.
Because they share a building with a organization, a Latinx immigration organization that handles immigration concerns, immigration asylum issues. And so they're actively involved because those are their neighbors. And they see them in the hall, they see them in the bathroom. That point of contact, the positionality makes such a difference. And I also think that consensus building that comes in collaboration, it gets honed over time so that when you see how effective it can be, it then lightens your load that you could think about doing more. And okay, now I've started a 501c3. Now I have, this organization that has spun out of the work that we were doing, and I can gift that to you. Now you go do that work. That's still a part of us. That is still the work of our congregation. That's still a part of our temple. But it becomes a shared vision in the true sense of ministry. And so for me, that was greatly encouraging. But it also meant I closed that chapter with like learning to never be the last leader. That collaboration is because you've got to be scouting inwardly and outwardly for who will succeed you, because the work is nonstop. Jesus says the poor will be with you always. Like, we still gonna have some more folk to feed and clothe and, visit in the prisons after I stop, after I retire, after my eyes close for the last time. And so that collaboration work helps them have a larger pool of laborers. Like, literally, this is stuff I've seen you do, so come on.
That education component in that for several of your interviewees being so tantamount, being so proud and so joyous of being able to bring that educational level to the persons in the congregations to build up that leadership as it moves forward is a really powerful way of thinking about collaborative leadership and building and legacies and things like that. So I wanted to point that out too. That was really wonderful. That was really powerful. I did want to also speak, just because I know that this is something that is within the realm of conversation for people, for us to think about. Many of our interviewees and many of our circumstances find us going from denomination to denomination to maybe even outside of Christianity. And I want to say thank you first and foremost for understanding that as an evolutionary process and spiritual growth, rather than saying that people are being wishy-washy about where they're going, and what they're doing. And I just wanted to sort of put a nod to that as well, to sort of give us just not ability to put a nod to the idea about leadership beyond even Christianity in your book.
Yes, that was I would say a surprising factor for me, because I'm like Baptist born, Baptist bred, like I'm on Baptist dead. So understanding people who have these 4 or 5 different contexts was really intriguing to me. I really had to learn leadership structures and what does an elder mean in your tradition? So what does this mean? What transfers, what doesn't? All of those were really keen lessons, but it also showed no one place gets it right. that lots of people found themselves going and having needs that were met in multiple spaces. In the same way, I tell my students, you ought to have multiple mentors.
Mhm.
Many of these leaders had multiple mentors. And I ultimately found that so useful, that it
Yeah.
isn't a sense of like, I'm taking my toys and like, you have wronged me, so now I'm going to be a Presbyterian. But, I've learned some things and I've expanded beyond what this space can hold for me. And now I'm going to go into a different arena and do some more things
Mm.
that I found really, really generative.
I thought it was generative as well. And I do think that it speaks to the considerations of queer leadership and this freedom of evolution as models for ethical leadership and sustained social change. You sort of move us into that sort of as you move towards the end of your book. And I just wanted you to sort of speak for a moment just about where you really do see and these considerations of queer leadership as models for ethical leadership and sustained social change for the future and how we move forward in that.
Yeah, so I think the empowering factor, empowering people to their own gifts, is really important. Really thinking through how to do that work and not just have all of the onus be on you. Bishop Flunder talks about this, she calls it leading up, or the wagon wheel model of leadership,
Right.
where the leader is in the center, but the spokes are where the work is. The spokes are like the trustees and the deacons and the ministry for immigration and the HIV/AIDS ministry and the this ministry and that ministry. And that's the church. Then when you see the work of the church, you don't look for the center, because it's the whole thing that makes it run. And so when I see models that share that, that have co-leaders
Mhm.
or co-pastors or executive pastors, or someone who's the COO and the new senior pastor, something that signals, I know I can't do it all. When I'm going to visit a church, that's one of the things I look for on their church website, or when I get in a church and I haven't looked in their program. Like, how do you identify your leaders? What type of hierarchy are you pointing me towards? And when I see ones that are pyramid shaped, where all roads lead, line after line is the pastor's name, I'm deeply troubled,
Mhm.
because when that person burns out, when that person is too tired, too sick, too old, too whatever, who has the skills? You start all over. Literally, you start from ground zero all over again. So I've seen that. And then I think finally, to look at the youth. I interviewed Reverend Katina and Naomi Washington Leaphart, and they were my
Mhm.
youngest interviewees. And yes, they had less years of being out. So when I interviewed them, they were in their 30s. So they had less years of being out in the world. They've both been out since their 20s, so about a decade of being out
Mhm.
and religious leaders. But their capacity to think complexly, and every one of the more senior leaders I talked to all had this season of exile. Either they were exiled from their religious community, or they were exiled from the LGBT community because they were still religious. And it took them some season to like integrate themselves into a cohesive, functioning leader that could do the things that they wanted to do. And these younger leaders didn't seem to have that same issue. And I don't want to hypothesize, because I didn't interview that many younger people, to oversimplify and say, oh, being able to come out younger in school, being able to live more fully, authentically yourself, like just leads to getting it more.
Mhm.
But that's where I look to signs of the future leaders as well, is that I look for, the leaders of Black Lives Matter who were
Right.
queer, and EFI practitioners who were, African Indigenous religious practitioners who were doing this work. And it wasn't a diss on the church. They were just saying that that's not where I'm fed for the
Mhm.
work of the social justice movements that I want to build. And looking at that and saying, why can't we do that? Why can't we find purpose in the ways in which this leadership is forming and shaping others? For me, that's really a hope, is that we'll look at our younger leaders, because yeah, they're going to screw up. I mean, I was at a conference last week, and it kind of tongue in cheek, they said, in your first 2 years of pastoring, like, you just kill the sheep over and over again, because you're learning to be a shepherd, and you keep leading them off a mountain, you keep leading them, near the wolves, and you're not aware. But then you get your sea legs, and you learn. So I'm saying that we have to be in the journey long enough to see the lessons from the seasoned and the youth, and to embrace both as effective models. And when I find persons who are able to partner together intergenerationally, I get super excited.
Yeah.
Like, aha, y'all have the magic rubric. Y'all have like figured out this cube here. Because for me, that is, I think, the best of all worlds, is the reason, the experience of age, and then the stamina of youth, and the awareness of, like, life's too short not to be yourself, fully yourself. That all of those things are so powerful, so helpful.
That's what I love about the deltas of the drawbacks to collaborative leadership. They're really, you only talked about them being a drawback for a little bit, but then you embrace the logistic, as Reverend Renee said, the full truth of being logistically messy and sometimes even impractical.
Yeah.
Because that messiness is tilling the ground for seeds to grow in that collaboration. So I really love that as well. And I also love that you were able to hone in on Rabbi Lawson's ability to embrace Judaism in her framework. And because I do a lot of work with Jewish communities, with the Jewish community as well. So some of those phrases like tikkun olam, the action intended to repair and improve the world, how you can find something and how that spoke to her heart, or how Mandy Carter found herself sitting, being spoken to by a Quaker, and finding that sensibility really speaking to her, and the work that she's done from that, the inspiration from that to build and to move on and to understand the collaborative model of that is really powerful. And I'm so grateful that you highlighted the ability to really highlight the success and the future, and how social justice and authenticity and social justice consciousness and spirituality and collective leadership is really fostered when you embrace this under the rubric of women as ethical leadership. I think it's really, really powerful.
Thank you.
So
Yeah.
I think that's really important. And I'm just really happy that you were able to also talk about, I said to myself that I wanted to say this to you, and I'm so glad we have the time to say it. It is impressive to me, Monique, how you take fundamental studies of leadership in your application to Black lesbian leadership, in that it highlights specific efficacies in leadership development, social justice, as almost an emergence to answering the call. It's sort of like when you find your efficacy, it's almost like you find the answer to that nagging call that says, I'm being called to something.
Yeah.
And that leadership and that religious leadership, as opposed to falling into the model of what has become religious authority that has been sort of hurtful and systemic, and doing it in a new way and in an enfleshed way.
Yeah.
And I thank you for that.
Thank you.
You're more than welcome. Is there anything else that you wanted to highlight or that you wanted to share with us as you move forward in your work, as you move forward to share this material? Katie Cannon told me when she read my dissertation, she said, don't focus too much, because now you're going to have to teach this for the rest of your life.
That would give me nothing but joy. It truly, truly would.
Very good.
I see this work, and I said in the Essence interview that I did, which I was really, really proud to do, because I grew up reading Essence. My mother did, my grandmother did. So to have Essence interview me to talk about queer leaders was like, I have arrived and I brought some people with me that don't get this level of attention was really important. But what I said was, I spent so many years getting this wrong publicly,
Right.
that if in fact I do spend the rest of my career teaching this book, it won't be enough
Right.
to do how wrong I was, and to recognize that each step is a step of recompense, to say, we can change, we can learn, we can unlearn the things that were given to us by people who perhaps didn't know better and people who did, that we can unlearn that and we can do something different. And so that's, for me, the hope of the work is that every time I get an opportunity to talk about it, that someone who's kind of skeptical at home, it creates the small pull on the thread, the red thread, that may get them free.
I do have a couple of questions in our Q&A, and one of them speaks to exactly what you were just talking to. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I'm sorry, Monique. But what other stories do you hope to tell in the future?
Oh, so I truly do want to tell these trans stories. I have not had any luck. I mean, part of this was the pandemic. As you know, we just did a project with Columbia with oral histories, and our student workers, they had a rough start. And people to say yes. And that just really wasn't the case before. Like I literally was an unknown entity. I was a lowly doctoral student, and then I was, a newly minted PhD, and I would just like randomly email somebody and say, would you give me 2 hours to talk about your life? And people would say yes. And I just thought that was normal.
Right.
So now that I'm doing the same things I did before and magnifying it, like, I'm like, look, I've got history, like, go look to the LGBTQ RAN website. You can see my work. Like, you can trust that I'm going to do this with a justice intent. Like, I'm trying to do good work here. And I'm getting crickets. So those are the stories I hope to tell, because I do think they will speak to something different. I think trans experience necessarily,
I agree,
will give a different texture to religious leadership that is missing from my book. And so it probably won't be another book. I know I don't have another decade in me to do another decade worth of interviews. But I would like those stories to be chronicled for the site. And if not, for article or some public facing work.
that's good.
I'm telling stories of Black child-free women. Those are the stories I started during the pandemic. I'm telling those stories of what legacy means and faith means for Black child-free women. I'm a Black child-free woman, and I wanted to find my tribe of unicorns. Particularly after the pandemic, where everyone went inward, and it was like you and your partner, or you and your mother and father, or you and your spouse. What happens to those who are unattached? And as a recent widow, these questions are like tantamount on my mind, like, who gonna put me in a home and make sure they change me? Like, these are questions that I have. So those are stories that aren't out there. There is growing discussion of Black infertility. But there's very little out there about intentional choosing to be child-free. And then I'll take the second question that I see, the difficulty in writing the book.
Greatest difficulty.
I think the greatest difficulty was really finding what the thread was. Because I sat with for 4 months, legitimately. I'd done all the interviews. I had transcribed everything. I had reams and reams of transcript printed out. And I didn't know what the hell I was doing with them. I just knew they were stories. And I knew I had a commitment to having over half, or at least half, the book be their story. And the book is right under 80,000 words, and 43,000 words are actual transcript. So I was intent about their stories have to be the book, but how how do I not, I mean, there are some good texts out that do the work of just, here's the raw oral history. They don't do any analysis,
Right.
not much analysis. It's just, this is a story you should know about. And I think that that's the work that we do public facing, like the work of LGBTQ RAN. That's the work of bio sketches. That's the work of the oral histories existing on the website. I thought for me doing this work for a book, I wanted to offer some analysis. And so what analysis to offer was my great difficulty. And when I stumbled upon ethical leadership, and when my friend asked me, well, what would it mean if this were a book for queer leaders? Me trying to wrestle with what would that mean? What would it mean that I say that this is the model of leadership, that this is what more people should aim for? And how do I write a text that makes that a convincing argument? Getting there with the stories central was the difficulty.
Right. Very good. Very good. And then we have another thought here. As a trans woman and priest, I find myself part of an international ideological war for our lives as trans people. How do we see ourselves being allies to us in this, given that U.S. evangelicals are among our enemies?
That's a big, big question.
It's a deep, deep question.
Candy Holmes, she posted, one of the interviewees, Reverend Candy Holmes, she posted a MSNBC story that was done about Uganda. I think it's Uganda, and their penalization of being gay, like making it illegal. And I posted the video when she posted it to say, like, this is why this work matters. Like, people are dying, like literally lives are being lost. So I'm not saying just go read these stories because it gets better and it'll like give you a warm, fuzzy feeling. I mean, that's good. We need that in the world. We need more light in the world. We need to know that. But for me, part of my allyship is to amplify as much as I can, to stand alongside, to stand along with, in the spaces that I'm granted access to. Right. But I think you, Derrick, as someone who pastors, who's in congregations, who's, speaking an alternate text, I feel like this is a great question for you as well, because I think you're doing the work in real time in a very practical sense.
Yeah, I very often, for example, I have a wonderful work that I'm still working on writing out because I preach it often, about the true meaning of transfiguration in the biblical Christian text as being seen for your true self, Christ being seen for the truth of who he really was in that moment, and how that is the shine, and that is the beauty, and that is the power of trans, and it's the divine power of trans. And being able to share that in an African-American congregation in that context throughout my ministry in Harlem is the least that I can do in my allyship, as well as to understand, like I said, with the New Testament background that I have, is to really look at texts and to free them up. And I don't argue the text with evangelicals because the mind is made up, not even just evangelicals, but there are certain texts where people have their debate points that are made up, and I'm more into spreading out and expanding the possibilities within the whole other text that we have that can really bring us life and sort of give us strength. That's one of the more powerful things that I find, and I'm in conversation with that, and I love being told that I'm wrong. I love being told that I want you to help me think through this in a deeper way, so that I can once again do that collaborative work of highlighting the voice rather than highlighting my voice. I love working with my trans community members in helping me to understand different ways of understanding the text and understanding ways of being in community that I'm not leading, but I have expertise because of my background in certain other areas, but I give what I can so that it can be transferred out to other communities. And that whole idea of how we deal with these hurtful opportunities for hopeful, not opportunities, but these hopeful engagements with what is happening in our country right now, and what has been happening and hasn't been highlighted, but we're trying to keep highlighting even more. It's a slow counter, but it's bit by bit. I'm waiting for more and more opportunities to sort of filter in my spirit to move through that. That's one of the ways that I can answer that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think I'll take final word and say,
Yes.
we also just have to tell our truths.
Yes.
Like I am open about how publicly wrong I was as an evangelical. I came out of a Jerry Falwell religious community in Virginia, like literally,
Mhm.
Knocking on doors, praying the gay away. And I tell that story because the people who see who I am now need to understand how
Yes.
far I've come and that I still have ways to go. So I'm clear. I'm honest with myself. Like, this is a heterosexist blinder. This is something, when I wanted to get the book, when it was finished, I sent it to a queer editor because I said, I think I'm doing it, but I still have the heterosexist blinders on.
Yeah.
So being honest about that. And
Beautiful.
I agree with you. Like, I don't spend more time arguing with the evangelicals, but I do those that I still have community with, because that's the community I come from. I share. Like, I posted this when the book came out in my little local town newspaper, because they need to understand that somebody from that town could think a different thought and have somebody think it was okay. And for me, that's, the little acts of resistance.
That's great. I have one last question for you. I know that you have all of these oral histories that you've done. Where can they be found again?
Please, 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 Mark, take us away. Tell us all about the wondrous world of the LGBTQ Red website.
Thank you so much, Derrick and Monique, for this fascinating, probing and illuminating discussion. And thanks to all of you who listened and offered comments and questions and your encouragement. Within a few days, you will all receive an email with a link to a recording of tonight's program that you can share with families and colleagues and friends. If you were interested in reading more about these oral histories and exploring the history of queer religious movements, check out the LGBTQ Red website. You might also particularly look at our events page in terms of future programs. There you will find announcements of future online programs, as well as recording of all of our past presentations. Our next webinar is coming up on June 15th. It will feature Reverend Jim Motulsky interviewing Joseph Plaster, Ph.D., on his newly published book, Kids on the Street, Queer Kinship and Religion in San Francisco's Tenderloin. In closing, I remind you that LGBTQ RAN is the first and foremost source of information on LGBTQ plus religious history. We are a very small operation that is funded through the generosity of friends like you. So if you would like to see more programs like this one, and if you share our commitment to ensure that future generations will hear our voices and stories, please, please help make this happen with your gift. I close with much, much gratitude to Monique Moultrie and Derrick McQueen for their insightful sharing with us. Good night to all.